Hello, and welcome to the 7th Annual Latinx Games Festival. My name is Jason Vega. I'm the Executive Director and founder of Latinx Games Festival. And I'm here with somebody who I've been paying attention from from the distance. I've been seeing them make the rounds on the internet. And this is someone I've actually really wanted to speak to for a very long time. Today, we are speaking with Jesenia Vargas, producer, writer, game experience aficionado. Jesenia, welcome. How's it going?
It's good. It's good. It's good. Enjoying my Thursday. I call it almost Friday.
Almost Friday. I love that.
Yep, almost Friday because we're almost there.
Thursday is sort of like this, it's like ad hoc to the weekend, right? You can sort of like hang your hat on, like there'll be a break there, but we are recording this sort of like around the holiday season. So I know a lot of folks are entering their break or probably already in it, but I'm curious. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Who are you and how'd you get into the gaming world?
Yeah, I'll try to keep this short, but as I was introduced, my name is Jesenia Vargas. Sometimes people call me Jay or Jesse. So, you probably see those names floating around there in different groups. But I've been in the industry for about a little over 3 years now combined. But I've been in the tech industry for more than like 10, 15 years doing people management, project management, content development cycles. So it's a little bit of my professional side. When it comes to like personal stuff, I'm actually martial arts. You can see my belt, so I do martial arts. And I'm a nerd, as many people in the industry tend to be, full on geek mode. So, but yeah, and Puerto Rican, my nationality, and my dad was in the army, so moved out. So lived overseas as well. So I have a very unique experience when it comes to like global, the global spectrum, because I lived in Germany for a couple of years. So love my global people for sure.
Heck yeah. So I have my aunts and my cousins are in the army, and I've spent some time on, and they also were in Germany, and I spent a lot of time actually on base in Puerto Rico, where you can get a bunch of really great video games at a super discount. That was my favorite thing about base.
Yeah. Listen, military people, we love our games. You stationed overseas. Sometimes you got to have some sort of entertainment, right?
No, it was all about video games on base with me, especially going to the stores and getting them for cheap. But I'm actually curious whether it was purchased at base or not. What were some of your favorite video games growing up? What'd you play?
OG, the Super Nintendo. That's the first one. I think my mom would joke that if it wasn't a book, it was usually a video game controller that was in my hands. Because my cousin was the first one to introduce it, and I was like a little baby, and he would have me in his lap playing Super Mario. So Super Mario Bros. Has a very, very much deep love for. And then after that, Game Boy Advance was my main preference choice, and the Glacier one, right? It had to be the Glacier one. That's kind of sort of see-through. And on that one, I played Pokemon and Golden Sun were the top two that I tend to play. So a lot of RPGs and a lot of, bouncy and all that stuff again.
The GBA has come up a lot in these interviews as a goated system that I think it has its props and people love it, but it only lasted 4 years, and then the DS sort of dominated, right? So people kind of forget about the GBA a little bit.
I mean, the people who loved it, we don't forget it.
Never.
I might have one hiding around there my kids play with and don't play with, because I needed to have my thing. But again, it felt right because processing, right? It kind of feels like a controller, when you think console controller, like that handheld, you had your hand like this, and it was felt naturally. So going from there, and then Xbox was my console of choice. It was actually the first console I got, and I got it in college because, my parents said, you got the Super Nintendo, you'll have that for many years. And so, but I went to college, the Xbox 360 was my first purchase for myself as a game. And I played Halo, played Call of Duty as well, the early Call of Duties, and then Gears of War. So those were the games I would play after that too. And I got into those kinds of games. Don't ask me to play it now. My son says that, I need to practice a little bit more, but.
So only the finest stuff. Seriously. So we're talking OG, old school gamer. That's rad. I dig it. Is there a moment, a moment that really grabbed you early on, a video game moment or something that really kind of stole your soul in playing video games when you were young? Anything
Stole
stand
my
out?
soul.
For me, it was like I see you have the Triforce up there. A Link to the
Oh
Past was
yeah,
one of the
Link to
games that
Zelda.
like hit me in my
Yeah,
heart. What about for you?
yeah. You gotta. I love the Zelda. I don't know, man. Like, because I loved every single one of them. They were so different, and I think that transition from like, going into like the Game Boy Advance type of games and into like those first person like Halo. Like, I think that was like defining moment because they were games that I would have never picked for myself. Actually, my friend who was telling me, no, when you pick a game, you have to pick three with your console because if you get bored of one, you need the other one. You know, and he was the one who recommended me playing like the Halo, and I was like, oh, Halo, right? Like, where's my Link? Where's my thing? And that was an eye-opening experience. You know, the exploration of different kinds of gameplay styles, different types of game loops, and just playing different things. Like, you don't know what's going to capture your attention until you actually play it. So maybe something that like I would have never picked up on my own. That's why sometimes I like people giving me recommendations because things that I would have never explored on my own because I'm like, you know, that's different. I don't want to do it. And then you start playing it, you're like, oh snap, like this storyline is great, or this narrative is great. I'm like, oh my God, like I can move this way. I'm like, oh, I'm actually doing good at that, you know. And it's like very satisfying when you can actually like nail it down and kind of get into it and understand how other people are enjoying that too, you know. And then the co-op, right? Because I used to be very one person, single, you know, single storyline, whatever. But then you start into, again, like Halo and things where you start doing the co-ops and playing with groups of people, and just it opens up the doors for other types of gameplay that I never would have explored otherwise, you know. So I think, you know, now that I think about it, that was a big, huge pivot and eye-opening experience of going from, you know, Game Boy Advance single player mode. They didn't have things, you know, outside of Pokemon, right? Pokemon started doing that with the little, I'm dating myself at this point. Like the little link cables that you had to connect between the two devices. That was another thing that kind of, I guess, led to that whole concept of like the co-op, of being able to say, oh my God, I can trade now. Oh, let's link together. All right, grab this cable and connect the two freaking like the two handhelds together. And that was eye-opening. They're like, oh my God, we never could do this before. Now we can actually play together, even though it's a cable. Now it's digital, right? Everything's like through the cloud or whatever.
Do anything because now, like
Yeah,
back then, if you didn't have your cable, you're. I mean, I'll just say you're asked out. Like you couldn't connect, you couldn't trade, you couldn't
so
battle, you couldn't do
maddening
anything.
too. They're like, did you bring your cable? I'm like, oh no, do you have yours? No, you know, you lost opportunity. Now it's like mobile, right? Because again, I play Pokemon Go, so because I couldn't Pokemon, you know, it stays with you. But yeah, that was a big, huge defining moment. Was, you know,
Are
those.
there any oh no, like that, like you mentioned, like 360 and like Pokemon, GBA. This is we're talking like there's like a couple of golden eras in gaming. That was like one that like block of like 2001 to 2005 had some great bangers in there. Is there anything that you're playing right now that are any games you're currently enjoying right now at the moment?
I left off playing games to a certain extent, to the same degree. Again, motherhood, kids, right? You know, sometimes you got to reprioritize gameplay time. But I've been getting into more games recently. You know, part of it is because, you know, I am in the gaming industry now. So I'm like, oh, I can play a little bit more games. But now I'm able to visualize it in a little bit of a different lens than I did before, which is very interesting and very exciting. But right now I've been playing like Wuthering Waves a little bit. You know, I've been going into that foray. I know like they were up, you know, TGA, they had been up, but I had met, I went to GDC about 2 years ago when I had a chance to meet with when I was doing like journalism for a small bit. I was able to meet with the people who were working on that game. So I kind of wanted to, you know, make sure to continue and playing that game. And it's fun. I'm very big in MMOs. I'm an MMORPG person. So again, I'm into that pivot, you know, into MMORPGs. But I haven't found something that sticks. I was playing Desert Online for a little bit, ArcAge, throughout the whole ArcAge experience. That was a big, huge thing. But yeah, right now I've been playing a lot of Peak with my buddies, you know, Peak, and Asuka actually, you know. So again, a little bit of a variety of different kinds of games that I would have not played otherwise. So
yeah, no, it seems like you're into a wide variety of genres. I guess anything that is fun, maybe something that can like can be a time sink or something you can throw like 5 minutes in.
Yeah,
fine, right?
yeah. I do like the time
Especially
sink.
now.
I love crafting. I love farming. I like treasure hoarding and like those aspects, like village building. Like I love those kinds of games, where I can sit down and, I think a lot during the day. So if I can go do something like semi-mindless, but still with strategy involved at night, then I'm like, all right, this balances out,
Kind of mindless as you're planning and strategizing everything.
I know. It's but again, being a producer, there's you can't turn it off. Like
it's always on.
there's an aspect of that you just can't turn it off, which I guess, when you think about it, it kind of ties in a little bit, right? It ties into, how your brain functions and works and the things that you like working on, the things that you're passionate about. It ends up feeding into the games just as like professional life, because that's kind of your personality, right? You enjoy these kinds of experiences, and it overlaps into the different ways that you express yourself in a professional environment, in a personal environment too, which is very interesting, right? When you think of like the psychology behind it. But I'm not a psychologist, I just know what I like to play.
Just play one on TV.
Oh yeah.
So you have like a diverse sort of like wide spectrum of career, we'll just say, right? Like you've done a little bit of everything. I say a little bit of everything, but you really like, you can see the journey, you can see the grind and climb, and sort of like in a video game, you're like leveling up. You've done a variety of things in not just video games, but tech. Before we talk about like how you broke into games, can we talk about a bit of your tech history and how did that happen? How did you break into the tech biz and eventually how that led into games?
Yeah. And it was interesting. It's like that term, like breaking into, right? Like there's how I entered in, right? Like yes, I agree that there's kind of like a little wall there, especially, for people's perceptions with saying, oh, you got to break into something because there's something there you got to break into. But so actually I went to school for creative writing. So, and I'll feed into a little bit on kind of like the content side, and there's a common thread that follows along in the different roles that I've been in, right? So I graduated from in creative writing. So writing communications, I'm very passionate about it, right? And so I actually over the course of my early career, I worked at Universal for a little bit. And so I became very passionate about like the entertainment space a little bit, being able to like work as a Potter person and Harry Potter, engaging with customers, engaging with people from that environment. But it was like immersing myself in those experiences, which is why I call myself a game experiences aficionado, less about like development, more about the experiences that get built up across different channels, across different modes of media and communications, because that is my passion. That is the thread, that commonality that goes into whatever career experience I went into. And I went into marketing, actually. So I started working at tech companies within the marketing space. And I happened over the course of like a couple other jobs in between. But after working at a marketing agency, I actually had the opportunity to work at a data company or a data tech company that had a marketing component to it. And I was there at a pivotal point where they actually landed a contract with Carnival. And the contract, because it was a data company, the contract was I would say was like my first real entry point into like a gaming type, because they actually had vertical slice that was for a gaming related experience. So, and to give a little bit of context for people who have not looked at my history, right? So this company in the Carnival, like about 2016, 2017, released kind of like a wearable band on one of their cruise ships. And so if you think about Disney's Magic Band, right? These were the same individuals and people who decided and worked with Carnival Cruise Lines. And it was a whole huge area about IoT, Internet of Things, hyper-personalization, all those things. So, and this is before what's the changes that are happening right now, right? And it relates from a data perspective. And they had a slice about creating this cute little follow you on your cruise ship, on your account, like a little, what do you call it? It's called Medallion Class Experience. And it's like a little animated character that you would be able, that's connected to your account, to your band. And when you're on this cruise experience, it would follow you. And so it kind of level up a little bit, and you could teach it and train it or whatever. And I was actually attached from a content side of writing the proposals, working with our CTO, working with executive leadership and helping make that happen. Like our team was actually the sprint leaders, the managers, the product owners of working with Accenture and Deloitte and like all these big, huge tech companies, and getting these experiences and the IoT experience live and pushed out on for Carnival on the Princess Cruises. And they actually launched in like 2017. And it was hyper personalization, right? It's pretty much Disney Magic Band on a cruise ship. everything you could do with this little armband, all your account information, all your things. You know, if servers wanted to know who you are, they already knew who you were because all the info was on your band. You know, that's all you needed, and things would get hyper personalized to you. So, and going back to the original conversation, you know, that was my first foray. And after that, actually, one of my coworkers who was actually a friend there, she worked at EA. So, you know, when my time was ending over at this company, she was the one who told me, hey, they have a role over here at EA. I think you would be great. I think you would be good because of all the experiences you had in the tech industry, working with IoT, working with proposals, with partners, you know, all huge threads, working with data, you know, of the marketing aspect, all these things. So she was on the marketing side, and it was on their EAX digital publishing team. So it was actually more on the web publishing, content publishing side, so less on marketing. And so it was a little bit different, right? Because it wasn't straight marketing. It was more working on the back end side and supporting the people who were working in the marketing department. And that's kind of where I really started getting into the gaming industry per se, right? No, actually the gaming industry, because it's EA. It's not per se, you know. But it started off working at a data company, right? You started working off like just working on tech, working on platforms, working on personalization of things, you know, and that that ended up leading to, because I knew somebody. And so I just say, hey, you would be good. You come over here. And before that, and I'm sure like people from our culture, whatever, there's not a career that you would automatically assume that you would get into, right? I never imagined myself working at a gaming studio or a gaming company, much like being a producer, mind you. Like that would have, like that just didn't exist in my world. So when somebody out there said, hey, I think you would be good working at something, that I was like, what? Me working in games? What? You know, I jumped on it. You know, and I had a lot of like self-doubt, right? I had a lot of worries because again, I came from marketing background. I came from like tech. So it was a little bit, I felt like it was a little bit different. But when I started working in there and I was actually hired to work, and I was as a contractor at EA, you know, the team I worked with was phenomenal. And they really acknowledged the fact that like, yeah, I had a lot of skills that, you know, it translated. They translated over, you know, and there are things that they could teach me on, right? Like I didn't know how to press buttons on the CMS system to a certain degree, or publish things on the Madden website, you know, which again, during the Madden 19, Madden 20, you know, I went through the whole cycle of Madden 20. Now I was the one in the back end, along with my person, publishing all the stuff in the back end to the Madden website, all of it, all the things, you know, so all that copy, all those art assets that were given to me through that pipeline, myself and my coworker, who, you know, was my supervisor, like kind of in the studio, we were the ones pushing that stuff out. You know, there's 2-man team there, but we were supporting an entire team of people from the marketing side who were, you know, collaborating with them, getting all the localization in, all the copy, doing the submissions, going through that whole pipeline. But I never imagined myself working there, you know. So
That's so awesome. So like, it's just so funny because, you know, in doing these interviews, you know, a lot of people really, I guess, especially when it comes down to like, you know, you mentioned what equal over here too, right? So like, I never thought I would ever have an opportunity at the video game industry. And a lot of us, you know, a lot of Latinos out there really don't. So you go from like tech, and then you're working on some of the biggest franchises in just pop culture, right? Like Madden, NBA Live, and you're doing all this work, and you're doing this for Electronic Arts. You're doing this for EA, right? This is a global like behemoth, and you're also managing things like localization and compliance over like multiple languages, I believe like 20 plus languages, different rating systems.
It was a culture shock to that extent, scale wise, right? Because I went from working at a privately owned, very small team, less than 100 people, less than 50 people at that company. You know, again, they were scaling up. They only didn't want to scale at certain points. And it was more like a consulting side, right? It was more like third party. If talk about third party, right? But more on consulting side from that, and then all of a sudden pivoting into this contract role. And I was only there for a while because it was a contract role. Unfortunately, it had ended. But going through that scale from one to the other, like it was a big, huge difference, because now I was working with massive teams, you know, and collaborating with them at a scale that like I would have never imagined collaborating at. And then the systems that they had in place. And it's like, you know, people don't realize that these AAA studios, AA studios, whatever number of studios, depending on how big the teams are, all the work that goes into the back end, all the pieces, all the navigation, whether the teams are really working cohesively together or if they're like, you know, a little bit more siloed, as some teams tend to be, only because of magnitude and scale, all those pieces that go into it, you know, that go into just the marketing alone, much less the development side, right? And trying to keep that engine oiled and making sure that these processes work, that, you know, things are being released on time, meeting player expectations. Like it's massive. It's massive. You know, it's not something to kind of scoff at. And I remember I was there during migrations too, you know, migrating. And again, I was only on the web, I say only, but you know, our team worked on FIFA. Talk about localization. FIFA's localized to the wazoo there, you know, FIFA, Sims. Again, I was working alongside with the UFC 3, you know, all these, again, the massive titles, and it was a small team across the UK. So I had coworkers predominantly in the UK area, coworkers out in Canada, and it was like multiple time zones of my own teammates. Right? Because we would be passing projects. If one person couldn't finish one, then we would work collaboratively together to try to make sure as a team, as a cohesive team, that, you know, we were supporting our IPs and then are supporting the teams who are assigned to those IPs. And like, yeah, 20 plus, 30 plus, you know, and submitting for localization at that magnitude scale. Some of it was, you know, pressing button, but you still had your other teams on the other side, the localization teams or the agency partners that, you know, if something happened and then you got a text that came in, right, that you're like, oh my God, this text was too long. Because, you know, going from English to German, for example, like, you know, it was fun. But also, you know, you got to also make sure that, you know, everything was to a quality standard, even for the players, for those locales, for those localization. The good thing is, like, I had a lot of experience with copywriting, content development. So when I was working, which I was an anomaly, right? That's why sometimes I call myself a unicorn, because I come from a writing background. So even though I wasn't hands-on writing myself, being able to collaborate and talk to, we have some great writers on the Madden team. Was one, right? Matt, who, you know, him and also other people who were also helping with writing and producing content for the site preemptively, right? I'd be like, this English text, maybe we want to kind of tweak a little bit, because when I send it to the translation team, it might end up getting a little bit longer. And that way I didn't have to like resubmit or whatever, you know, like in collaborating with them early on and recognizing and knowing and giving suggestions, again, consulting, right? You know, being partners with them, not just pressing a button, but really collaborating and talking to them across all the team, all these layers. And then again, migrations was madness. Like, imagine you think a website of like 10 pages, but then 10 times 20, 30, 40, 50 languages. That's a lot of pages. That's a lot of copy. That's a lot of content that has to get sent out, you know, and meeting deadlines and meeting timelines, and then you just quality checking and having QA. Like it was just massive. You know, again, I didn't have to do that before at a data company, right? I just had to like, press website, English only, and that's it. That was problem solved. And then now I go into this massive thousands the CMS system, you know, like it was insane. It was fantastic. I loved it.
That's amazing. So like, no, of course, you're very passionate about it. Also, it seems like you had to be open to learning a lot of different things, have your head on a swivel, be able to manage multiple projects, and also just like, there's no off switch with what you're doing, right? Like you really have to be
and not even during the holidays either, right? Like, you know, and then that goes into like service operations or things that are, you know, currently live, maybe any product, right? Like they say like, yeah, holidays, take a break. But when it comes to these things, like it's an always on thing, right? So website breaks, content breaks, server goes down automatically because AWS decides to do an update, you know, like all these little layers and things people don't think about. Like we got to be very close attention and have the right support and right systems in place to have coverage. Because again, the players are going to have expectations. Players are not going to, you know, they're like, well, you should have plans. I'm like, oh, we're trying. We're trying, guys. We're trying, you know. But yeah, it doesn't turn off. You know, once things go live, once things are out there in the public, you know, before, like pre-production is obviously very different from post, depending on the model, right? If it's just a game that's live services or a game that's like, oh, this is what you get, you know, they're completely different animals.
For sure. I mean, actually, funny enough, speaking of a completely different animal, you end up being a senior writer. So you go from all that to being a senior writer for Boss Rush Network. So you cover MMOs, mobile, DEI, right? So was there like a story or any trend that made you sit up and think, okay, there's like a real shift happening here in gaming?
See, shifts have always happened in gaming. It's interesting because, like, you know, but it happens in smaller silos. You know, there's not one big, huge, cohesive shift. But I remember one of the things I covered, one things I'm really passionate about, as you can tell, DEI is it's a very big, huge thread, content, and just discovering little stories. Is Tales of Kendara. I'm forgetting the last name. You know, but that one was fantastic. I think they were presented with an award at TGA. Was it a TGA? About not last year, but the year, not this year, but I believe last year. And I apologize, like I can't remember the last name for the life of me right now. The last term, but it was based out of I want to say like not based out of Africa, but it was one of those stories where it was like, and it threads into the DEI concept, but like there are a lot of regions and places that want their stories told in games, that sometimes you don't see it until it goes into a big global scale, or you don't see it until an award's given out, or you don't see these shifts and these things happening in some of these other non-American, non-UK, non-hub areas, that like there's a lot of growth happening in a lot of wonderful places, right? Like Africa's growing, like India obviously has their thing. Latin America's, it's booming to a certain extent, right? These are huge markets that until they get into a stage per se, like you don't really see them because they're not spoken up a lot. But there's so many great, fantastic games, great development happening in these other areas and spaces that, you know, being able to work as a journalist for those years. And that actually happened because like I had gotten laid off, and I said, you know, I really want to pivot back into games, because when my contract ended at EA, I went back into tech because, you know, again, it's difficult to stay in. I couldn't stay in. I had 2 kids. And so I made a decision to say, you know what, let me continue working in tech, build up some other core experiences, and then I'll make my effort, you know, when that kind of stint ends, or I feel like I'm ready to come back in, I'll come back in. But unfortunately I had gotten laid off. And so during that year, I said, you know what, this is going to be an area in a way that I can kind of get my head back into the pulse of what's happening in the industry. And writing, again, I went to school for creative writing. It was a natural avenue for me to kind of keep my hand on the pulse and really dig in deep and looking into different stories. So that Tales of Kandaru, and I know I'm saying it wrong and I apologize. That one was very impactful for me, because again, it was a recognition and realization of all these other spaces that were growing, and being able to tell those stories, right? Because as a writer, like one of the things I love to see is stories that are being told, and kind of elevating those stories, you know, bringing attention to some of those stories where people may not have been able to visualize it before. And I also love working with the Boss Rush team, you know, and again, these are volunteer teams. And a lot of them are like very passionate writers and having their own topics and things that they're passionate about covering and doing, you know, even game reviews, right? You know, finding little gems or little things that maybe they're not gems for other people, but for people who might be looking for that, right? And that's how I actually came across Wuthering Waves, you know, which is a game that I'm playing and toying with right now. Playing, you know. It was part of that journey a little bit, you know, being able to go to GDC as a journalist, right? That's how I was able to go out there, being able to talk one-on-one before I got back into the industry, and being able to network and communicate and conversate from a development standpoint on like their experiences of building and what made them passionate about building those types of games, and for the audiences that they care about building these games for. But yeah, that one. I was so excited, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. The artwork was beautiful. The storyline about a father and son, like it was just fantastic. Just overall, you know, and just being able to like be there and witnessing that moment and writing about that moment was something that I was like so excited. And, you know.
So one of the topics that you covered at your time there is DEI. Now, I think we all know that, like, I mean, DEI is basically under attack. I guess there's no other way to really put it.
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, no, it's definitely like a rough time for that field and folks who have who had the chops and benefited, from DEI initiatives. But like, it has DEI in games has a lot of layers, some baggage, but let's focus on the positive here. Have you came across an example that made you hopeful, or maybe you thought, hey, people should be paying more attention to this when it comes down to DEI in games?
Yeah. I know here's the reality, right? Um, we are a very diverse industry. We are very unlike some of the other more tech really well. I mean, unless you go into fangs and things like that, it's a little bit. I would say a little bit, but it's very different in games. And when you look at the people who are working and building these experiences, they come from all over the spectrum. We are even with people who work strictly NA, anything that happens globally affects our games, our audience segments. We may be focusing on one audience, but at the end of the day, it's being fed into a global audience, whether we realize it or not. And the people working in games are very diverse. So even if people don't say or have programs for it, the reality is we are a very diverse and passionately inclusive, or passionate for inclusion across all spectrums, all levels. We have there's a lot of studio leaderships from like smaller, from indie. Again, the indie is a very exploding to a certain extent, especially with the volatility of the market and how things are happening. We got to call that out for what it is. There's a lot of passionate people about building diverse experiences for themselves, for their studios, for their team members, and having that embedded in the experiences. Some studios struggle with it. Some leadership probably need to do a better job out of it, but our studios, our teams, our player base is global. It's global, whether people want to put the blindfold on or not. And so like those expectations, and regardless of where it comes from, recognizing that beauty, recognizing that exists, there's power there. And there's a lot of people, a lot of spaces, a lot of communities, even right now, that maybe it's not formal or informal, that are thriving because of the diversity of thought, because of the conversations we're able to have from an environment, whether it's from Canada, whether it's from things like I'm part of multiple different communities, and I'm able to interact with, again, on a development side, on a professional side, with people who work and build studios out of the UK, whether it's an art studio or a co-dev studio, and engaging in those conversations it's a beautiful thing, because you're able to see the different perspectives and how something works in the UK might not work in the US, or something in the US is affecting, how people are handling situations up in Canada, funding, building businesses, all these conversations, like there's the exploration of those ideas. There's a huge melting pot right now, and it's kind of like, again, it's like under the water. People may not be able to see it right now because there's a lot of negativity, but when you dig really deep, there's so many beautiful like diamonds and gems that are happening even now, where like you see some of these studios that are just popping up, and it's just filled with passionate, driven founders who are really trying to change the game, people who really care about, creating differences, and supporting those people is critical and important, right? Whether people realize it or not, like, yes, it's going to start small. Yeah, we're not quite there yet, but being able to feed into that, be able to support those initiatives and kind of building it up, right, is really important. And, I see Ben Cablo right now working on like MDev and working in the Midwest and trying to create other areas. And yeah, like, again, these things start small. People say it's not quite big yet. Not talking about Ben's situation in general, right? It's just an example. But being able to see those little things pop up and us allowing that and us helping water it, that's something that we should be proud of, that there's these things, and these initiatives, and these individuals and people across multiple spectrums, across multiple different global areas, who are trying, they're working on it, they're trying to do it, but it's gonna look small. But like, the more people who water, the more people who support, the more people who kind of help with in many different ways, you'll see those changes. Maybe not at the scale that people would wish and like it right now, but we got to think long term, right? The long term is it's a waiting game to a certain extent. There's a lot of risk involved in long term. I speak that, again, as project manager in me, we gotta look forward, but at the same time still staying present in the moment, and being able to recognize where those little opportunities are, and feeding into that. And supporting it, whether it's just sharing things, whether it's just verbally acknowledging things, or whether it's that, there's a lot of beautiful things that are happening, underneath the surface of the negativity. There's just so many amazing people. That's why I pivoted back into games, right? I went out into the tech. I went into fintech, right? I worked at a startup fintech that was scaling up. So I was there for mergers and acquisitions. I was there working on all that stuff. And I got a different thread of experience there, working with content development from social, marketing, web development, all the things, product development, all that stuff. And then when I got laid off there, I said, like, honestly, the people are the real gems. The people who are in the industry, the people who are passionate, not just about games, but about the building of experiences for themselves, for the other people around them, projects that they're passionate about, being able to come back to that thriving creative environment and being able to feed into that and support that and do that, like that right there is things that people, when you get out, you realize, I need to come back in because these are my people, and it's different. It's not the same as like movies or entertainment. There's commonalities. But even just the thread of media, the multiple consoles, the multiple gameplay types, mobile versus console versus PC, like it's just so diverse, not just diverse in thinking, but diverse in media, and building stories across, and threading. And it's just, as you can tell, I'm very passionate about all this stuff. That's why I came back.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see, I can hear your passion. And I love that because obviously, like, this is, like, you need passion and you need love. It's still a job, right?
It is an industry that you gotta work at. You gotta work for, right? It's not an easy industry. It's not something that, there's a difference between doing it as a hobby, doing it as a passion project, doing that, and some people they're like, oh my God, it's not a passion project. And it's okay. Again, there's nothing negative about that, right? But it's also, there's a business component. There's a business side, people's jobs are at risk to a certain extent, building a game for other people, there comes with expectations. There comes with like models, and there's work that's involved in that. It's not always fun in games, but the goal is to create fun in games, right? So and balancing the two out is the challenge sometimes. Sometimes you got to put your business hat on and think strategically, think, risk wise, think about budgeting, money, whatever, blah, blah. And then there's the fun side that, you got to keep that because again, that you're trying to build these experiences, build these elements of fun. You got to enjoy doing it too, and there's that balancing that happens between the two.
So you're somebody that clearly like can handle a lot thrown at you, which I think makes sense that, a lot of your career in games is like a producer, right? Like somebody that has to sort of like get everybody together. So like, let's talk your time as lead producer on Romancing Jane. So like you end up being this keeper of all knowledge for Romancing Jane. Let's talk about the day-to-day. How do you keep a team of 13 plus people moving in the same direction while things getting overwhelming?
Yeah. And Rainbow Unicorn Games actually, it's a startup for the most part. It's an indie studio, right? It's very small, so it's in the very early production stages of that. And actually, we ramped up to 13 people rotating this past year, right? Because I was there a little bit before, trying to help get things set up and supporting as a producer there. And it's been interesting because I say interesting, and challenging because like what people don't realize when you're building a business, building a startup, or you're starting things out, trying to keep 2 people is different from keeping 3, 4, 15 people across multiple different disciplines, right? The way they work is different. The way that they think through information is different. The way that they process workflows is different. And in the early stages, there's nothing set in stone. There's no workflows that exist. You're not coming into a business that already has established things. I literally, me, the founder, all the whatever leadership is in there for any indie studio, especially, Romancing Jan, for the RUG team, there's no processes that were really set in place. There were, but there weren't. And so, the challenge has always been, and this is not just them, it's just in general, like how do you keep these people motivated, or these individuals motivated, on track for the same vision, having conversations with each other. One of the unique things is that diverse, right? Multiple time zones. We had people working out of like the European time zone and also out of California time zones. So some of the challenges there is like, okay, how do I create a model that, again, and these are volunteers to a certain extent, right? Because the early stages, funding is always a challenge. Right now, funding is huge and major, so how do you keep individuals who are also doing full-time jobs or whatever, or looking for jobs, motivated and on track and delivering something a team-wide in early production stages? And a lot of that is tools and also meetings. But the meetings had to be something that was productive, right? Wasteful meetings and having no conversations and no direction wouldn't serve a small team that only had 2 hours, 3 hours to support in a week. So I had to be very, very, very intentional in how and why I was creating meetings, how and what's tools for. And we ended up using Notion right now, right? Different tools like project management tools, but from a position of how do I source and combine all the information, having as a resource. So even if I'm not available or they're not available or they're not there, they can keep up to date ad hoc. And also maintaining conversations, maintaining communication. Even though if somebody wasn't able to make it to a meeting, then it's my responsibility to make sure that they're up to date. Doing check-ins with them ad hoc or during the meeting, and keeping them on track and being the person to help remind them or guide them, or saying, giving directives to a certain extent, and kind of being that leader and that little, thread holder, and just pulling where I need to pull or loosening where I need to loosen, right? Creative person needs to go off into the sunset sometimes and just cook. You got to let them cook. But again, sometimes you got to pull the hook to make sure they don't cook too much, because again, we still have a direction that we need to go to, because creatives love creative. And sometimes you got to give guardrails. And my favorite thing is talking about guardrails, right? And that's the way that I was able to get these individuals to really collaborate. And again, everybody was fantastic to work with on that team, is just making sure that they had those guardrails and that they knew what the guardrails were and what the timelines and expectations were. And I use Notion, right? Use the project management tool, and nothing complicated, small team. We don't want to overcomplicate them, don't want to overwhelm people, because we got shit to do, we got things to do. But a lot of it's communication. A lot of it comes down to communication, whether it's through email, whether it's through Discord, whether it's through Notion, whether it's through whatever tool, it doesn't matter. It comes down to being available for the communication, enabling the communication, and empowering the communication to happen, right? Those multiple threads. Because again, I don't always want to be the one pulling the thread. I want to empower them as their own individuals, as the experts in their discipline, to contribute, and if I'm making all the decisions, which I should not be making decisions, they need to be making decisions, how am I empowering them and giving them the tools and giving the resources so they can cook and come back feeling like, man, I got this, I delivered this, and rewarding them for the effort that they did, guiding them to the direction that we all need to go as a team. And then if there are questions asked, then it's my responsibility too, or not, right? Depending on the team dynamic, to go back to the founder or the leader, and the RUG was that, I had to direct, it was a very small team, very close team, very big on communication, very big on enabling and empowering individuals to really contribute, because again, early stages, early production. And it's tough, especially with volunteers. It's completely different from working on again, big scale EA, where they had all these masses of processes and everything already had its way of doing it. So all of a sudden they're like, hey, there's nothing. We got to figure this out together, guys. And just figuring out what's going to work without overwhelming and doing too much, right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, obviously, like working going from EA and then having like a small indie team, it's a very
completely different
mindset and discipline. You're still utilizing all your skills. It's just a very different beast.
Yeah.
So like with Rainbow Unicorn Games, they have a clear mission around being inclusive, right? Mm-hmm. How did that influence the way you manage the project and like working with different disciplines, like within narrative, art, and the overall development of the game?
It did and didn't, right? Because again, like I mentioned earlier, like the beauty of the game industry, stuff like that, like you already work with a diverse group of people, whether you realize it or not, right? Most people know this, right? It goes without saying, very diverse group of people. I think it affected more in the direction of like, on the empowerment side, right? So because the founder and everything, everybody was recognized that it was built on the aspect of inclusivity and diversity, there was more empowerment, more feeling of I can actually speak to these kind of conversations and have some harder conversations that in a traditional environment that may have a certain directive or stakeholder expectations or whatever, right? A different kind of work culture, right? That doesn't allow for certain conversations to happen within different kinds of spaces. Here, again, because it was a small team, they were very focused on that. You know, it was known to be a fabric piece of the entire, not just the company and the studio, but also in the games that the game that Romancing Jan that we were trying to build and create. And so that empowerment piece, there was a lot of amazing conversations about body type, about characterization, about the storylines, about, because again, Romancing Jan is a very narrative driven, very relationship driven game. Like, okay, what kind of relationships do we want to have? Relationship with everybody, those conversations it's a little bit easier to have to a certain extent because it allows for that. And people feel empowered to have those conversations in those spaces. And then they feel like they can have a little bit of ownership, right? Like, hey, they're contributing. And it's powerful to see that happening and seeing the effect of these open conversations feeding into all these little design decisions that are made with the creative director or vice versa, or even the narrative stories, and seeing different threads happening and different conversations that are a bit more, it would be challenging in another environment, but here it's just organic and just happens, right? They answered it, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. No, 100%.
Yeah.
Especially with it being a creative field, depending, especially on an indie team, you'll normally find that it's actually pretty diverse, a variety of different people usually available on.
Yeah, but it also is in bigger teams. It's just scale sometimes makes it feel more siloed. And sometimes, again, there is politics in studios and games, and it's in any business, right? There's some things that you got to be aware of culturally across different regions, different environments, different laws, different things. So again, as you scale up, it becomes a little bit, it's a different kind of challenge that you face, and being able to have those spaces and those kinds of conversations. And leadership, right? Leadership is really critical and important. If a leader or a manager doesn't allow for those conversations to happen in an organic way, and it feels forced, it doesn't empower the people to have those conversations, because it creates uncertainty. Can I have these conversations? Am I enabled to have these conversations? If I have these conversations, what's going to happen? Is there going to be a backlash? How is it going to be taken seriously? When you have these bigger teams or bigger studios, again, and it comes down to leadership, and again, it comes down to communication and expectation setting, right? Like empowerment. And again, smaller teams, because they're closer together, it feeds into a little bit more, because you're like literally in each other's faces, so to speak. So the lines and the boundaries and the siloing isn't as common. But again, it also depends on the business model, right? Different teams run differently. I can only speak to the experiences I've had. But that's the challenge. But they've always been diverse. It's just you don't see it as easily. It's not communicated as much. Or it's a little bit smaller on diversity, right? The bigger the team, you start seeing that diversity spread start going smaller because of the way they make decisions on leadership. And we know, right? We know that there's challenges in upward mobility, whether people, it's like you said, it's a grind. Moving upwards and being positioned. That's why one of the biggest things why I loved working and I wanted to support the RUG team is, again, being in those spaces, empowering those spaces, bringing people up. If people see you doing it and being successful, or even not successful, okay, like the fact that you're doing it in an environment that maybe it's not normal, allows other people to see that happening, whether you're successful or not. You tried it. You were there. You're in that space. In that moment, you were in that space. You're taking up that space. That empowers other people just by existing, and that speaks volumes. So being able to support that team, versus, other teams, like that's why I, again, did it on the voluntary capacity, and working with them.
It takes a lot, especially like when we're talking about like on a volunteer basis, like, you're really contributing to the art, like the art as in like the creative. The way I say video games and game development, it's like our version of a canvas, right? Yeah, it's collaborative. It takes all these teams and all these different disciplines, but it's a canvas. And like, I love hearing that, like, no pun intended, that you did it for the love of the game. But speaking of another game that you worked on, again, having your producer hat on, you worked on Heads Up, a party game. So
yeah, I'm working with that team right now. You know, I've been doing it for a little over 2 years.
So like a big part of your role is managing like live content, offers, you know, updates, store submissions. How do you decide what to prioritize when you're juggling, you know, creative ideas, deadlines, and performance goals?
Oh, favorite producer is prioritization. Collaboration, right? See, it's a different environment. So, you know, for individuals who, I mean, I think people would know, hopefully at this point, what Heads Up is, right? Like it's the game that when you go to Disney or Diaz, it's the one that, you know, it's a party game. You have the word card and you know, flip up or down. You know, it's a great party game. You know, much loved by people who play it. You know, it's 10 years old game, so it's been around for a while. So juggling prioritization is different in this, because it's not pre-production, it's not post-production. You know, you got to balance out now, like updates from like store expectations, things that are mission critical for like if something break. You know, player expectations on a 10-year-old game are very different from a player expectations from when the game first launches. So navigating that, you know, we do a lot of, like I did it, like, you know, we've done surveys before to see what the player expectations, those challenges are. You know, we got, like, again, a phone device that gets updated all the time. So, you know, making decisions on, like, you know, what do you support, what you don't support. So it's a lot of very, very in the weeds conversations with not just the leadership, but also with the development teams, right? Because I work directly with the development teams who are on the iOS side. Like it's the original developers, right? They had a vision, the studio had a vision and a mission. He has his ideas and he has his stuff, and collaborating with him and really, really getting to know where to align on, like, that vision as people who know the capacity of the game and where we want it to go with the player expectations. And it's a lot of conversations about, like, what's feasible, what is coming down the pipe for, like, content, right? Because again, we love supporting, like, certain events. We have Black History Month content. We have, you know, Women's History Month content. You know, St. Patrick's Day is big for us. Like, you know, there's a lot of, we have, like, the cute little decks and ideas that we want to do, but balancing out the content pipeline with, you know, the needs from the development side. You know, I got spreadsheets, right? You know, we go into the meetings and say, hey guys, you know, what's the vision that we want to see for, like, for example, 2026? What are the players asking for? And then getting in the weeds and saying, okay, like, how realistic is it? You know, is it going to be able to be, can we do this? You know, is the players ready for this? Or can the system actually handle it, right? Because there's a lot of great ideas that we always have, but with tech that's XYZ years old, you got to navigate that too. Like, can the tech actually handle this? Like, what's the development going to be? And sometimes until they start doing the work, they don't even know and realize whether or not it's functional or not. And navigating those conversations day to day, week by week, kind of feeds into some of that prioritization. Will it impact, you know, the revenue side or whatever side, right? Again, it's a business, right? You know, in order for us to be able to support experiences that the players want, we got to have the developers be able to work on it. We got to pay them, you know, we need to have funding to be able to support the ability to have these features pushed out, and kind of balancing out, like, those little priorities. And there's usually, it's like a spreadsheet can be big or small depending on the size of the team, but, you know, we have a lot of visions and a lot of things that we want to implement on both on the Android side and the iOS side. And it's just a lot of conversations that always end up happening of, like, you know, well, what can we do? What do we want to do? And what can we afford to do? You know, that's not going to break the experiences for the players, but also not break the game, because, you know, there's always that. And also even like updates for, like, because again, Apple likes to change requirements sometimes, and again, age ratings, or, you know, say for example, like, you know, they have this new, like, the liquid glass that Apple decided to release out, like, this past year. You know, those affect us, right? You know, these little updates that these other third parties or the platforms, when the platforms make decisions on, like, hey, we have this new feature, we got to go back and be like, all right, we got our list of prioritization. Okay, like, you know, they have this thing, like, what do we scope in? when and what's going to be proper and appropriate, and doing surveys and testing. Like the testing is a critical thing too, right? You got to test, are players really going to care about this? Do they want it? Are they screaming no, or are they actually, saying yes in other behaviors, and being able to monitor that data? So data feeds into it, which again, being somebody who worked in a data company, I'm like, ooh, data. Yes. Give me, the analytics, because the analytics speaks a lot. Players may not realize, like, how they interact and how they play, the feedback that they give, these surveys that sometimes the developers or the studio teams are trying to push out. It's really important to give feedback. Maybe not all the feedback is going to be able to take into account. It's not always going to. Players are very passionate about the games that they love, and developers and things like love and thrive on feedback. But there's a thing that you gotta also take into account on the back end, on our side, that sometimes either the tech can't do it at that stage, or maybe that's just not in the vision of the game where it needs to go, or there's other things involved that the players can't see. And so navigating that and then balancing that out, like it's fun. And at the same time, I also have to protect my team, right? So sometimes I got to make hard decisions, and not just me, but other producers and other teams got to make some hard calls. And even the leaders have to make hard calls on features or things that we want to push it out, but sorry, players, we can't, because, they might not realize that maybe it's not in their best interest. And sometimes pivots happen where they try something and it tanks. We've seen it. They make calls. But it happens. That's the nature of the beast, especially when you're doing something that's entertaining and fun. And again, people are passionate about things. Everyone's gonna have an opinion. Everybody's, But again, like, I gotta balance out, to your point about the prioritization on what gets shipped and what doesn't. And sometimes it's stuff that people don't want. Sometimes it is, But sometimes we have to, we do the best that we can to make sure that we would balance everything out, and making sure that the experiences at the end of the day are quality and where we want the game to go in the future.
The career fields that you've worked in are so demanding. You got tech, right, which is in itself, has it's like an onion, has its own layers to dissect. That could be like 5 more podcasts, right? But and then you have video games, which is tech, but then it's also creative. How do you stay inspired or avoid burnout in this very demanding industry?
Burnout is massive, right? Burnout comes from it's a personal accountability thing. It comes down to, like, knowing yourself and listening to yourself, right? When I was in the fintech company, I experienced massive burnout. Right? Because especially when you're so passionate, you're creative, you want to do everything, you want to be things, and that's okay. But there are times that you got to learn when to put the stop lever on and find the spaces that's going to fill your cup a little bit more, and balancing that out and allowing yourself and giving yourself permission to step away from, whether it's a project, whether it's a studio, whether it's an industry, right? Being okay with putting the brakes on for a little bit, and, and also being in recognizing when before the burnout happens. It's very difficult at very high-paced environments. Again, it goes also back to communications and leadership as well, on making sure that, processes and things are in place that allows people to have opportunities to put those stop levers. But again, that's why I said, like, personal accountability is very important. And it's hard. It's very difficult. It's very easy, especially people who are neurodivergent, people who have worked continuously in those environments. You get used to that being your standard, and you get unused to being in the slower, and that's where I was for a while. I was fast-paced, and now I work on a game that's like 10 years old, and I'm just like, what is this pace? What is this? People are breathing. What is this? And again, it's part of my responsibility to give people breathing room and breathing space, and be like, no, it's okay to stop. It's okay not to think too far forward. Be present in the moment. And I think sometimes, again, when you're working so fast, being present in the moment is what ends up, you forget about that, because you're thinking so far ahead, you're planning, you're doing this, you're doing that, and when you could start getting too in the weeds, and you start feeling that stress, and you start feeling tired all the time, I believe in mental health a lot. I've done therapy myself, I'm never afraid to have conversations about that, but things are you eating, are you sleeping, and are you touching grass? right? Being present in the moment. Sometimes people forget to eat, people forget to drink water, and people forget they'll say drink water, which I will struggle with, eating and sleeping, even just those basics. Once you start missing some of those pieces, you're on a track to be like, oh, your body is not functioning to those things. You can't run. And the thing is, you can run when your tank is empty. You can, right? People do that all the time, but you shouldn't, because again, the recovery period for that is a lot longer than people realize, right? Once you experience extreme burnout, recovery is a lot harder, because again, you start used to that standard and slowing down. So, one ways that I try to mitigate that is surrounding myself with individuals as well who recognize or know me and can also help me be that blocker. They're like, how about you say no, or things, and surrounding yourself with a community of individuals who, like, one, personal accountability, but who empower you to make those calls, empower you and say, no, it is okay for you, and having people to also check you, right? Whether it's a mentor, whether it's, again, a community of people, your personal network, your personal group, your personal family, that becomes a foundation for you to also be able to have like the external factor of calling out, hey, go to bed, go to sleep. You look tired. Oh, I am tired. Go to bed. Okay. And then you can start having those conversations within yourself, but you also have that again, personal accountability, have the hard conversation with yourself and allowing yourself the permission to take those breaks when your body is telling you, when your brain is telling you, even when the demand is high, it's okay to take that PTO. It is okay to leave that project for tomorrow. I remember when I was at a creative agency, I would make mistakes because I was managing huge workloads for clients. I had 13 rotating clients. I was doing a newsletter for each one with them every month. And I remember my manager, like the business owner at the time, would tell me, he's like, hey, you're not working for a hospital. People are not going to die. And again, I have high respect for people who work in that industry, high respect for nurses and things, because like it is a rough and tough, and I have ultimate respect, and so again, I caveat that because again, I know sometimes using certain references could be taken out of context, but he would say, hey, you are not in that industry, right? It's okay to take that break. It's okay to make mistakes, but nobody's going to die tomorrow if that project that didn't get shipped out today doesn't get shipped out today. Yes, there is expectations. Yes, there is accountability that could happen. But at the end of the day, like, your life is important. Your existence is important. You are important and critical. If you can't function to the best capacity, you're going to feel it and you're going to internalize it. And so taking those breaks, taking the opportunity to say, what? It's okay, and telling yourself it's okay allows you to kind of avoid a spiral burnout. And when you're spiraling that burnout, acknowledging it is difficult, owning it is difficult, and pushing through it is immensely difficult too. But again, being positive in those environments is very difficult. But that's where the surrounding yourself and putting yourself in spaces, even in that moment, you may not want it or need it. You're going to silo yourself out. Like, just doing like the little outreach with the right individuals can kind of help you start kind of pulling that. But again, it's okay in being okay with that. And it took a while. It took a long time for me to learn those skills. Sometimes you gotta hit the ruckers, and sometimes you gotta go through it to understand really like what your things are at. I don't wish it on anybody. Again, the industry is known to have very tough cultures of high intense workloads. Recognizing that, asking early, talking to leadership and management, what is the expectations, and also giving those like radar flags, and then being okay with walking away, which is hard, especially in industries. You got to be okay with walking away because your sanity and your health and your security is more important than anything else. And then as a producer and as a lead or whatever, helping managing workflows, like, I take that very important. I'm very passionate about that, right? Because my goal is, I don't want people I work with, collaborate with, just because a project was like delayed or whatever, feeling that immense pressure, because I've been there, I've done that, and so my role, like whenever I'm doing management of a project or whatever, I want to make sure that, it's done in a way that's logical, healthy, that's, even if people have to crunch for a little bit, it's not the standard, it's not the expectation, it's not the goal marker, right? Because people's lives are important. And yeah, burnout is just, ugh. You don't want people going there. And if you have to push people there, then you really got to think about why you're pushing people there. And if you're the one that, has seeing that happen. But it's self-evaluation, right? Yeah.
Oh, there's so many nuggets in in this interview here, and so much great advice as we close this out, if you can give one piece of advice to someone trying to break into industry today, what would that be?
One piece of advice. Know what your mission and your goal is, right? You know what your passion is, and really sitting with yourself and doing the goal setting, right? As you kind of mentioned before, and we talked about, like, my journey was not linear. My journey was very bouncy, right? I know there are individuals who are like, I got to get in here right now. I got to get in here right now, or I feel like a failure. You're not a failure, right? Every step, every opportunity is an opportunity for growth. Whether it's failure you learn from, lack of success you learn from. It builds up different kinds of skill sets, right? But when you had a vision for yourself, and the vision, and being okay with the vision pivoting, like, but that vision can be your guiding light, right? And even when you pivot out, look at different ways that, you can continue applying those skills, like continue like building up those skills. If you have this mission, it should be, it's okay for you to kind of look at different avenues while still driving towards that goal. And the goal, the personal goal, it could be a 2-year goal, it could be a 5-year goal, but that goal is really the critical piece. Because even if you pivot out like I did, right, going into fintech, working into marketing, and then realizing I don't want to do marketing anymore, I want to do this, it allows you to make those pivots and being okay with it, because at the end of the day, you know what your goal is.
No, that's awesome. Know your goal, and obviously the path to get into games or any real career, any career path is uniquely yours. Jesenia, this was awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. How can people find you? Can you tell everyone how they can get in contact with you for either opportunities or just to connect and maybe pick your brain?
Yeah, I mean, the best way is through LinkedIn. I'm even though I don't post actively 100%, I am very active on LinkedIn, whether it's engaging with individuals and in different communities, right? I love messages, so anybody can reach out to me at any point in time on LinkedIn. That's the best way, and I'm pretty sure feel free to just quote it out somewhere, and it's by my name, Jesenia Vargas. I think you should be able to find me that way, and that's the best way to reach out to me. I also have a portfolio site, but it's I gotta update that, so you gotta it's you'll see it when you guys see my LinkedIn, but yeah, that's gonna be the best way.
Thank you, Jesenia, so much for doing this. This is awesome. Reach out to Jesenia on LinkedIn. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for the 7th annual Latinx Games Festival. My name is Jason Vega, and I'll see you around.